everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Oshi no Ko co-starring with Kana Arima, Chapter 19 to 28, Bowing Down for You. 1882 words having readjusted his mental state, Aqua Hoshino lifted his foot, preparing to step out of the rest room. But before he could even take that step outward, a voice came drifting in from behind him first. Hold on a moment, Aqua Hoshino. The habitually cold-tempered Aqua Hoshino, for once, let out an odd-sounding noise. But there was really nothing to be done about it. Through that exchange he'd just had with Minami Yuji, it had become genuinely impossible for him to hold up his usual indifferent, cold-shouldered facade. It was just like a child who had only just been scolded by an adult. Terrified that some careless little movement of his would draw another scolding from the other party, and the crucial thing was, that other party also happened to be devastatingly correct. That was exactly the kind of mental state Aqua Hoshino was in right now. He swallowed nervously, and couldn't help subconsciously running back over what he had just been doing. Wasn't he just standing up, then getting ready to walk out the door? Surely it couldn't have been him stepping through the door left foot first that had set Minami Yuji off, right? It shouldn't be that, right? Is there something else? Aqua Hoshino drew in a deep breath, forced himself to brace mentally, then turned his head sideways to ask. But very quickly, that question got stuck right there at the edge of his throat. Because there was no blame, no scolding at all. The Minami Yuji in front of him had merely lowered his own body slightly while at the same time reaching out a hand. What are you doing? He couldn't help asking. Are you planning on going to see Miyako with that face? Minami Yuji didn't say anything more, he just casually pointed at the full-length, body-height mirror set up beside the rest room. Aqua Hoshino froze for a moment. He reflexively turned his head to the side. Only now did Aqua Hoshino realize that the marks left on his face were an absolute, complete mess. Setting aside, for now, the dappled tear tracks all over that cute, childish face of his. His clothes were also wrinkled and creased all over, and his collar was in complete disarray. Calling this miserable appearance unfit to look at wouldn't even be an exaggeration. Only at this point did he understand that Minami Yuji calling out to stop him hadn't actually been to take him to task at all. He turned his gaze back around. Minami Yuji had already extended his palm. Very seriously, very meticulously, he wiped the marks clean off Aqua's face, while at the same time, bit by bit, straightening out the collar and the wrinkles in his clothes. Aqua Hoshino. Honestly speaking, as an adult himself, watching the other party perform these kinds of motions, as if caring for a genuine small child, left him feeling a touch embarrassed too. If you looked carefully, Minami Yuji's calm expression seemed to carry a certain kind of magic to it. Under Aqua Hoshino's hazy, indistinct gaze, that expression seemed to overlap with the expression of his late mother. Ai Hoshino. For just an instant, the originally still uncomfortable Aqua Hoshino went suddenly quiet. In this very moment, he actually felt as though he didn't want to disturb the other party. And on the other side Minami Yuji, having tidied away every last trace, let out a small breath, finally got him cleaned up. He didn't have nearly as many thoughts swirling around as Aqua Hoshino did. He simply thought that Aqua Hoshino was, after all, the foster son of his own top superior, Saito Miyako. If he let Saito Miyako catch sight of Aqua Hoshino weeping like pear blossoms in the rain, and on top of that looking visibly like he'd been beaten up, then he'd probably get a great big hat slapped onto his head right there on the spot, the likes to bully fellow koyaku on the filming set label. That wouldn't do at all. The reason a reliable adult was reliable was precisely that he didn't let slip a single detail that needed checking on. He carefully swept his eyes over Aqua Hoshino's face. Handsome and adorable, though his forehead was a touch red, it was covered up by his bangs, so it shouldn't show. Apart from his eye sockets still being a bit swollen, he was basically the same as usual. Like this, there shouldn't be any real problem. Minami Yuji nodded in satisfaction, lowered the hand that had been arranging Aqua's bangs, stood back up again, and prepared to fully wrap up this heart-to-heart meeting with Aqua Hoshino. He heard, coming from behind him, Aqua Hoshino's hesitant voice. Minami Yu. The voice paused for a moment but very quickly grew firm. Can I call you Yuji Nii? Hearing this, Minami Yuji turned his head back in surprise. The Aqua Hoshino behind him was looking at him with utter seriousness. Although the gaze hidden beneath that golden hair was awkward and ill at ease, he was nevertheless making a real effort to lift his head and lay his expression fully bare. Why so suddenly? Minami Yuji stopped in his tracks. There were, in fact, no shortage of Japanese words that could convey the meaning of older brother, but what Aqua Hoshino was using here was the half-nickname, pet name variety, one that carried both a strong intimacy and a strong respect. I can't really explain it either. Aqua Hoshino pressed his lips together. If I had to put it into words, I think. Yuji Nii, your life experience from your past life is probably a fair amount richer than mine. He unconsciously slipped into honorific speech. And on top of that, Aqua Hoshino drew in a deep breath and put his thoughts into words. Didn't you say it earlier, Yuji Nii? To pay attention to the thoughts and feelings of the people around me. I think changing how I address you, this is my first step toward changing. Honestly speaking, being already at not a young man's age, saying these kinds of things did make Aqua Hoshino feel a little embarrassed. But he felt he absolutely had to say them. He absolutely had to convey his thoughts to the person standing in front of him. And besides, from any angle you look at it, I've received all kinds of care from you. Addressing a senior in life this way should be no problem, right? Minami Yuji. A long, drawn-out silence. In all of Aqua Hoshino's life, there had never been a moment quite like the present where time felt as though it were stretching out so long. His heart was thumping like a drum, a kind of inexplicable tension welling up inside. He had to admit, human beings really were a curious sort of creature. Even though he knew perfectly well that there was a high probability Minami Yuji wouldn't refuse his proposal, the tension in his heart still couldn't be suppressed. And it was precisely at this moment, while he was sitting there uneasy, Minami Yuji's voice suddenly rang out. Whatever you like. Aqua Hoshino's pupils gave a slight tremor. The result was obvious. But the joy in his chest still, in this very moment, came welling out in a way impossible to disguise. He forced himself to steady this surging emotion, and those sea-blue, jewel-like pupils of his turned toward Minami Yuji, carefully opening his mouth to speak. Minami Yuji responded, then nodded. After all, going by age, I really am older than you. After saying that line, his hand, too, extended outward under Aqua Hoshino's watchful gaze. Please look after me from here on at Ichigo Pro, Aqua. He, too, extended a hand. Gone was the needle against thorn confrontation from earlier. Aqua Hoshino wiped at his eye sockets. He took the initiative to grip the other party's palm. The time arrived at a bit past 3 in the afternoon. Since the scenes that had to be shot here were already done, the uninhabitable house, props crew was already in the middle of packing up the set. Aqua Hoshino, having stepped out of the rest room, looked up at the deep blue summer sky overhead, and for a moment actually went somewhat lost in his thoughts. Although it had only been a single, short morning spent with Minami Yuji, for some reason, his state of mind carried an illusion as though several years had passed. He adjusted his mental state a little. Aqua Hoshino walked outward, his thoughts replaying the exchange he'd just had with Minami Yuji. Just a moment ago, when he had been about to leave the rest room, Minami Yuji had specifically called out to stop him. Aqua, when you head out in a bit, make sure to take a look at the expressions on Miyako's and Director Gotanda's faces, got it? Expressions? Aqua Hoshino, not quite understanding, turned his gaze over. But all Minami Yuji gave him in response was a gentle wave of his hand. You'll get to see something quite interesting. Time returns to the present. Something quite interesting. Aqua Hoshino quietly muttered that line under his breath, then lifted his face and scanned all around, searching for the figures of Saito Miyako and Gotanda Taisher. The props crew was packing things up. The camera crew was calibrating and checking the equipment. The actress, too, was in the middle of removing her makeup. During a stretch of time as cluttered and bustling as that on a filming set, finding two specific people should, by rights, have been a rather difficult task. But Aqua Hoshino did find them. And on top of that, he located these two people extremely quickly. The reason was actually very simple. Because these two people, mixed in among the crowd, had in fact been secretly observing him this whole time. Saito Miyako would carefully lift her head, then lower it again, her gaze full of concern, and tinged with a touch of guilt. Godanda Taisher, in the spaces between his puffs of smoke, would pretend casualness and shoot a couple of glances his way. But however they did it, those two of them had, all this time, been caring about him in their different ways. Aqua Hoshino closed his eyes. Only now did he understand exactly what Minami Yuji's line about, "You'll discover something interesting," really meant. Had he really been that stupid all this time? The people right beside him had been paying attention to him this whole time, had been caring about him this whole time, and yet he himself had turned a blind eye, sunk deep inside his own world. Thinking up to this point, he drew in a heavy breath and turned around, facing the rest room where Minami Yuji was. Deeply, with all his strength. This was, for him, the very first time, apart from AI, that he had ever respected another person this profoundly. Walnut-chan knew history. Arknight's Enfield, picked up a Gugagaga 100 Power Stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Chapter 20, Re, 0, starting a child actor life from zero. 1962 words. Something's off. Something was definitely off. That was the strongest feeling running through Saito Miyako's mind, as she held her water glass and drank from it. As for the reason behind that feeling, it was actually pretty simple. Because her foster son, Aqua Hoshino, was doing something that she found rather impossible to comprehend. "I brought some chocolate snacks from home. Yuji and I want some." Right under her watchful eyes, Aqua Hoshino fished a packet of snacks out of his bag, and of his own accord, struck up conversation with the black-haired Koyaku beside him. "No, hold on. Who even are you?" Watching Aqua Hoshino's expression, still somewhat gloomy, yes, but considerably brighter than before. Saito Miyako, his foster mother, felt her foot give way beneath her. She very nearly took a clean tumble right there on the spot. It was mainly because the scene unfolding before her eyes was simply too impossible for her to process. If the person standing there had been Ruby Hoshino, she could at least have accepted it. But that was Aqua, for crying out loud. The very same Aqua Hoshino who, from morning till night, always wore that gloomy face, that boy whose inner thoughts no one could ever guess at. Forget about him taking the initiative to approach someone. Even just him being willing to exchange a sentence or two with another person would have left Saito Miyako stunned for quite a while. And yet what was the situation laid out in front of her right now? Not only had he struck up conversation, he was even, as though actively trying to ingratiate himself, asking Minami Yuji whether he wanted some snacks. Saito Miyako sucked in a sharp, HSSS, breath. She really was a little incapable of grasping the situation in front of her now. And the crucial thing was, it wasn't just this much. Her memory drifted back to a short while ago, when they had still been at the filming set. All this time, "I'm truly sorry for making Kyoko-san and Godanda Taisher worry about me." Aqua Hoshino had lowered his head and bowed, speaking those very words right in front of both her and Godanda Taisher. In that instant, Saito Miyako had no idea what kind of expression had taken hold of her own face. But judging by Godanda Taisher over to one side, who'd gotten burned by his own cigarette without even noticing, only catching on a second or two later and letting out a yelp of pain. The expression on her own face had to have been equally spectacular. Because that was Aqua Hoshino. The same Aqua Hoshino who kept absolutely everything bottled up inside his gut, who was precociously mature to an absurd degree, had actually bowed down to the two of them in apology. What's more, although Aqua Hoshino's words sounded as cold and detached as ever, from the very intonation of those words, two adults who had clawed and rolled their way through life in society could clearly perceive that he was being sincere. There wasn't a hint of social pleasantry in any of it. He genuinely felt sorry from the bottom of his heart, and was apologizing to her and to God and a teacher for real. The very moment she picked up on this, the shock in Saito Miyako's heart dispersed, replaced by the relief of being able, at long last, to set down a burden she'd been carrying. She could finally put her heart at ease. Ever since Ai Hoshino's death, she had, in truth, been living with her heart in her throat the entire time. Because she'd always had this inexplicable feeling that one day, in some place where she couldn't see him, Aqua Hoshino would silently slip away from her. Just thinking about that possibility had her secretly keeping watch over him in her daily life all this time. But now, it's finally over. Setting her water glass down, watching the clear ripples spread across the water, Saito Miyako murmured to herself. And the person who had brought about these changes? Saito Miyako looked over at the black-haired Koyaka sitting on the couch, eating chocolate with one hand while reading a book with the other. Minami Yuji. She remembered it perfectly clearly. Back at the filming set, this boy had been the one to seek her out himself, and on his own initiative had asked to meet with Aqua Hoshino. Honestly speaking, at that point in time, she had actually been a little worried. Mortally afraid that Minami Yuji would get verbally shut down by Aqua Hoshino so hard he wouldn't be able to get a single word out. After all, in her view, no matter how outstanding Minami Yuji's acting skills might be, he was still just an 8-year-old child. Aqua Hoshino, on the other hand, was a different story, born ridiculously precocious, and on top of that extremely closed off internally, in a state where, with the exception of a select few, he simply wouldn't communicate with other people. But looking at things now, it seemed the thing she'd been worried about hadn't happened at all. Forget about Minami Yuji being verbally shut down by Aqua Hoshino. Judging from the result, Aqua Hoshino was practically like a completely different person, and on top of that he was using an extremely intimate nickname like Yuji Nii that was treatment even she herself didn't get. You have to remember she had cared for the twins, Ruby Hoshino and Aqua Hoshino, for a full 7 years. Right up until the present day, Aqua Hoshino still addressed her with the honorific Kyoko-san. She felt secretly incredulous, surreptitiously sizing the other party up. From between the strands of his scattered black hair, those still, dark eyes of his seemed to carry an aura that defied description. Minami Yuji. As if he really did possess some kind of indescribable magic, enough to draw every gaze in the room straight onto him. The old Saito Miyako would never have believed in anything like a meat pie falling out of the sky. But looking at things now, how could this even be called a meat pie falling out of the sky? This was straight-up gold falling out of the sky. Smacking her perfectly square on the head, leaving her whole person dizzy from the impact. Cough cough, this comparison might not be the most fitting one, but that was exactly the feeling. Although Saito Miyako narrowed her eyes, looking at him with the faintest trace of a smile, and marveled inwardly. So just what exactly was that brightly colored book the other party was holding in his hands? A children's picture book. Sure enough, he was still just a kid after all. With that in mind, she slid over to him with a smile on her face. Yuji-kun. Minami Yuji lifted his face. What book are you reading? She asked, smiling. Oh, Japan's National High School Exam Question Solutions. Want to take a look? He flipped the cover around to show it to Saito Miyako. The smile froze on her face. Saito Miyako blanked out Japan's. Every single word was Japanese, so why couldn't she understand a single bit of it? And the most important thing was, why on earth was an 8-year-old child even looking at this kind of stuff? At your age, shouldn't you be hugging a fairy tale book, or watching tokusatsu, reading manga, things along those lines? What are you doing thinking about university entrance exams of all things? Possibly having picked up on her confusion, Minami Yuji even went out of his way to offer an explanation. It's nothing. I was just pretty curious about the educational level of Japan's high school to university transition, so I went out of my way to borrow this from Aqua to take a look. Does that make sense to you, Auntie Kyoko? Saito Miyako. Like hell that makes sense to me. The corner of her mouth twitched. It was hard to imagine that she had just, of all things, heard the phrase curious about Japan's educational level, come out of the mouth of an 8-year-old child. Are you really 8 years old? You feel like you're a fair bit more precocious even than our Aqua over here. Over on her side, her face was filled with speechlessness, she had no idea how to respond. But it was just at that moment that Minami Yuji, over on his side, suddenly opened his mouth again. Speaking of which, there's another thing I've been curious about, is this place really the Ichigo Pro agency? Although 3 days ago, he had picked up the forms from Saito Miyako, and filled out the paperwork for transferring agencies. Actually showing up at the Ichigo Pro agency in person like this, however, was still a first for him. Saito Miyako sneaked a glance over at Aqua Hoshino at the same time, still not daring to bring up the matter of AI Hoshino in front of him, and could only clear her throat lightly to mask her awkwardness as she said, "The environment is a bit on the rough side." Minami Yuji couldn't help shooting her a sidelong glance. He really wanted to ask her, "You're calling this a bit?" Setting aside, for now, the way the practice rooms inside positively radiated desolation, giving off the unmistakable feeling that no one had used them for ages. But the problem was how come there weren't even many staff members around either. For a top-tier talent agency, the staff had to be guaranteed in both quality and quantity, only with that could they successfully manage and market their artists out into the wider world. And yet, wasn't the situation in front of him just way too dire? The number of departments was pitifully small. The former Bikomachi Idol division had already been disbanded. You could have practically set up sparrow nets at its doors. The management department had a mere 2 or 3 people, heads down at their work. The general oversight division that any normal agency would have, in other words, the directorial office, the place responsible for coordinating every department, was even more devastatingly hit. It had been straight up eliminated outright, with everything now run by the company president Saito Miyako single-handedly. Although he had known all along that AI Hoshino's death, the death of the flagship idol whom Ichigo Pro had poured massive resources into building, would deal a heavy blow to Ichigo Pro, he genuinely hadn't imagined the blow could be this heavy. And under circumstances like these, the one thing Ichigo Pro was running with any real flair and noise was probably their recently emerging influencer management department. But based on the current timeline, the medium of influencers had only just begun to develop in any meaningful way. After all, smartphones themselves had only risen to prominence in the last few years. This scene, how should he put it, was just way too pitiful and shabby for words. It even had Minami Yuji, at this moment, unable to hold back a sigh of dismay. It really did seem like, ever since he'd been reincarnated from the womb, he'd been running hell difficulty dungeons the entire time. After all, strictly speaking, this Ichigo Pro was no longer a case of 100 things in ruins waiting to be rebuilt, it was simply starting from absolute zero. Walnut-chan new history, samsara game, starting in the long dark with my waifus help us hit our targets, 100 power stones equals +1 free chapter for all. Chapter 21, yes, but not entirely, both are the answer bonus chapter 15 words ahem, ahem, ahem. The gaze of the suddenly silent Minami Yuji was simply too piercing, even Saito Miyako, who had been clawing and rolling her way through the industry for ages, couldn't help but let out a few light coughs to cover the awkwardness. It really was quite awkward. After all, Ichigo Pro's current strength genuinely couldn't be put on display. Tossed into Japan's industry, a sea so vast it teemed with talent agencies, it was probably among the lowest of the low. But Yuji-kun, don't go by what Ichigo Pro looks like now. Back in the day we actually counted as a pretty famous small-scale agency in the industry. Saito Miyako felt she had to offer some kind of explanation at least. Ichigo Pro had been wealthy once upon a time, had collaborated with no shortage of Titan-class agencies, and was on a roll going from strength to strength. She and her husband Saito Ichigo had been positively rubbing their palms together with excitement, planning to expand departments, fully intent on tearing the small-scale agency label clean off Ichigo Pro's head. As she got toward the latter part of all this, Saito Miyako's expression visibly clouded over. Because what came after, everyone knew that story. AI Hoshino, the flagship idol of Ichigo Pro, had bloomed like a comet, and then in an instant departed this world. Ichigo Pro had crashed and never recovered, and only today, 2 years on, had it begun to show even the slightest sign of bouncing back. She couldn't help but imagine. If only AI Hoshino hadn't died. If only they could return to that era that had once belonged to Ichigo Pro. How wonderful that would be. It'll come back, that era. A steady voice suddenly rang out beside her ear, pulling her back out of her recollections. Saito Miyako lifted her head in surprise. Only then did she realize that Minami Yuji was looking at her with an utterly serious expression. As if drawing something out of that sincere look on his face. Saito Miyako, who had only just been steeped in sad memories, couldn't help but break into a wry, soundless laugh. With a teasing tone, she spoke up, "Honestly, sometimes I really can't figure out where Yuji-kun gets all that self-confidence. No, I suppose that's only natural. Yuji-kun, you've already proven what you're capable of." "That's right." Saito Miyako rallied her spirits anew. Although she had lost AI Hoshino forever, she had now found a Koyaku just as outstanding, perhaps even more outstanding than AI. Powered by Minami Yuji's superhuman charm and acting skill, Ichigo Pro was sure to return to that flourishing era of years past. "I believe you can do it." So Saito Miyako said. And in response to her speaking these very words, even Aqua Hoshino, whose this life's ultimatashi is AI Hoshino stance was practically a known fact, sitting over on the other side, didn't show any particular reaction at all, as if this was simply a matter of course. But what neither of them had anticipated was the ever-confident Minami Yuji, contrary to his usual self, actually shook his head at this remark. "It's not just a matter of you believing in me, I've been believing in you all along too, Auntie Kyoko." Indeed, his acting skill was genuinely top-notch, LV8 acting, not just among Koyaku, but even among adults. Only renowned veteran actors could just barely go toe-to-toe with him head-on, never mind the fact that he also had the born star trait as a trump card. But Auntie Kyoko, do you think an agency can be propped up on the strength of just a single artist alone? Minami Yuji had tossed out another question. The sudden question made Saito Miyako furrow her brow slightly. Based on her 2 years' experience as an agency president, a single artist, and an artist as evidently possessed of star potential as Minami Yuji, at that, could absolutely prop up the rise of a small-scale agency. AI Hoshino was a textbook precedent right there. Just have a top-tier headliner, and the agency could naturally enough orient all its activities around that headliner, and in this way piece together, bit by bit, a web of connections within the industry. At the same time, expand the functions of the other departments, then leverage the relationship network they'd built to feed back into the agency's newer artists, bundled deals, putting in a good word ahead of time with familiar producers, that kind of thing. This old hands pulling up the newcomers model was an extremely common operational tactic within agencies. Yet, for some reason, Saito Miyako found herself hesitating. Because she just couldn't shake the feeling that this answer wasn't the one Minami Yuji was looking for. After all, even she had vaguely picked up on it. The Minami Yuji in front of her might look 8 years old, but he seemed to look at issues in a far more far-reaching way than your average adult. Probably sensing the hesitation in Saito Miyako's heart, Minami Yuji offered his own take. "Yes, but also not entirely. Both are the answer." Was a top-tier headliner important? Of course it was. And unquestionably so at that. But what about beyond the top-tier headliner? Of equal importance was also the quality of the agency itself. Minami Yuji held up a finger. That's right, the quality of the agency itself was equally the single biggest factor in whether an artist could go far. Although Ichigo Pro had endured a full 2-year dry spell, the overall quality hadn't actually dropped a notch. Staff were scarce, yes, but every single one of them was taking this work seriously, no half-hearted slacking. This much could be inferred from the original work too. Ichigo Pro had not only succeeded in surviving in the industry, they had also seized the influencer wave at exactly the right moment and turned a profit year on year. And all of this had to be credited to the Saito Miyako standing right in front of him. Not only had she, as a single mother, smoothly raised Aqua Hoshino and Ruby Hoshino, she had also juggled the development and operation of Ichigo Pro at the same time. After all, inside the Japanese workplace, the unwritten rules of seniority by tenure and favoring men over women had long since been etched right into the bone. Sometimes a collaboration on the verge of being finalized would just get scrapped on the spot because the senior person in charge was a woman. The client side would conclude that this company was completely unreliable, would actually pick a female employee to negotiate the deal, and this was no exaggeration whatsoever. So, to put it without any exaggeration at all, Saito Miyako, who had single-handedly carved a blood-soaked path through the industry with Ichigo Pro, and lived to tell the tale, she was practically a superhuman. And therefore, it's not just that I believe in myself, I also believe in you, Auntie Kyoko. We are definitely going to succeed. As he said this, a pale, fair palm extended forward. Saito Miyako. Staring at the pale palm in front of her, her expression visibly froze. Over these 2 years, being a woman, she had kept Ichigo Pro alive up to today. No one could possibly know just how much pain and hardship she had eaten through to do it, but even so, she had still kept on struggling away in the can't get any rot in a black sludge of this industry. She had never once craved validation from anyone other than her husband Saito Ichigo. But the moment someone really did stand in front of her and speak words to the effect of "I trust in your abilities," she still felt her heart give an inexplicable tremor. She raised her head, sweeping her gaze all around. What came into view inside Ichigo Pro was nothing but the scars left from 2 years ago, without so much as a sliver of vitality. Only a sparse handful of employees were heads down at their work. But when she pulled her gaze back into focus, what entered her sight was Minami Yuji with his hand extended. He was looking right at her, and in his eyes a star-like brilliance seemed to twinkle. Without the slightest hesitation, she lowered her body and gripped the palm he had extended. We are definitely going to succeed. We have to succeed. We absolutely have to succeed. Right here, in this can't get any Ratana industry, she would make her and Minami Yuji's dream come true. The goal was admittedly quite a lofty one. But unbelievable as it was, gripping Minami Yuji's palm, she just couldn't shake the feeling that this goal absolutely could be achieved. Walnut-chan in P for more. New history, Samsara game, starting in the long dark with my waifus help us unlock these community rewards. 100 Power Stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Chapter 22, Tagawa 2132 words. The time arrived at 6 in the evening. After all, they'd been running around for a whole day, needless to say of Saito Miyako, but Minami Yuji and Aqua Hoshino on the other side had also long since begun to feel a touch of hunger. Because of that, Saito Miyako didn't hesitate either. She picked up the phone and just went ahead and ordered 3 takeaway meals. It wasn't that she was bad at cooking, rather by this hour, going out to buy ingredients, prepping them, and then actually cooking would simply have taken too long. Far better to just settle the matter with takeaway and be done with it. Even so, she had at least taken the children's nutritional needs into consideration. The takeaway she ordered was the comparatively well-balanced Taishaku set meal type. And during this stretch, Minami Yuji also asked the question he had been rather curious about: where had Ruby Hoshino gone off to? That's right. Ruby Hoshino was, at this point, nothing more than an ordinary 8-year-old child. Generally speaking, Saito Miyako should have placed her at the agency and had the staff look after her in her stead. Yet from earlier right up to the present moment, he hadn't caught even the slightest glimpse of Ruby Hoshino. The question he posed was very quickly answered. As it turned out, Saito Miyako had been worried that with her own work being so demanding, and with Aqua Hoshino in the middle of filming recently, Ruby Hoshino, with no one around to watch over her, would end up feeling lonely. So she had sent her off ahead of time to the countryside, where her own parents would look after the girl in her place. Minami Yuji nodded. A reliable adult, by rights, wouldn't have much in the way of particular thoughts about a small child like Ruby Hoshino, but the other party was, after all, also a reincarnator. So he still wanted to take the time to explain his own situation to her along with Aqua Hoshino. But since the other party wasn't here for the time being, then there was nothing in particular for him to dwell on. And so things went, eating on one side, chatting idly on the other. It wasn't until they were halfway through the meal that Minami Yuji suddenly set down his chopsticks. Auntie Kyoko. Saito Miyako paused her own chopsticks and looked over curiously. This takeaway, could you order one more portion? He pointed at the half-eaten taishaku in front of him. I can, sure, but is one portion really not enough for you? Saito Miyako opened her mouth, a touch genuinely taken aback. To accommodate the appetites of both Aqua Hoshino and Minami Yuji, she had specifically ordered adult-sized portions. His appetite was that large. This much food wasn't enough. Could it be that the perfect koyaku also had a perfect appetite? No, it's just that there's someone else at home who might not have eaten dinner. I was thinking of bringing something back for her. Probably having picked up on the curious expression on Saito Miyako's face, Minami Yuji went ahead and offered a line of explanation. But what he clearly hadn't expected was that this remark only stoked Saito Miyako's curiosity even further. Even Aqua Hoshino over on the other side had stopped his chopsticks, silently pricking up his ears. After all, although Minami Yuji had signed with Ichigo Pro, right up to this very day, his legal guardian had not once set foot in Ichigo Pro, not even a single time. On this point, Saito Miyako had in fact already grumbled to herself several times over, thinking that the other party's guardian was being just a bit too cavalier about it all. One had to keep in mind that the other party was, after all, only an 8-year-old child. Even if this 8-year-old child happened to be Minami Yuji, the guardian still couldn't just be a complete hands-off shareholder. Actually, maybe they really could. Casting her mind back over the past 3 short days, and Minami Yuji's distinctly unchildlike performance throughout, Saito Miyako quietly swallowed her bellyful of muttering back down, but she still couldn't help opening her mouth. The takeaway is no problem at all, but I'd also like to meet Yuji-kun's guardian once. Would it be all right if I paid a visit a little later? Truth be told, she really did want to meet the other party. Even, if it were possible, she wanted to ask the other party just how on earth they had managed to raise and educate an exceptional talent like Minami Yuji. It was just that on the previous few occasions, Minami Yuji had seemed to deliberately wait at a bus stop a fair distance from home for her to drop him off and pick him up, so she had never quite found a suitable opportunity to call on them. Meet them, huh? Minami Yuji, normally so crisp and decisive in his actions, fell into a rare moment of silence. Lifting his head, he first glanced at Saito Miyako, then at Aqua Hoshino, and only then did he give a small nod. All right. But the environment at my place isn't really suited for receiving guests. You two will have to brace yourselves mentally. So he said. Minami Yuji was the most gifted person at the Masayama orphanage. With those words from director Minami Mao, in other words, her own adoptive mother, Minami Reiko was in deep agreement. Because she had been there to watch Minami Yuji grow up the whole way, truly, watching him grow from a tiny child right up to now. Beginning to walk upright in a way that defied normal human comprehension before he was even 1 year old, then at the mere age of 2 already able to run and jump, to speak with full eloquence and charm the grown-ups around him, and even, through the sheer ease with which he solved high school exam problems, making it all the way onto Mamashima's local news, leaping in a single bound to become a genuine local celebrity. A rare talent. The adults who knew Minami Yuji almost without exception spoke of him in these terms. There were even some who tossed around the idea of whether they ought to send Minami Yuji off to Tokyo. After all, if they could only stir up enough hype around him, they were guaranteed to ride a fair wave of attention and rake in no small amount of money. But in the end, it was director Minami Mao who, single-handedly, pressed down all those outside voices. Do you people even count as adults, behaving like this? Don't you feel that this kind of behavior is shameful? Yuji is only 2 years old. The normally gentle Minami Mao had, at that moment, lost her temper for the very first time. But even so, there were still no shortage of news reporters who came flocking to the orphanage out of curiosity, hoping to catch a glimpse of this prodigy of Mamashima. And time in the midst of all this, arrived at the point when Minami Yuji turned 5. At that point in time, Minami Reiko felt that she had perhaps, in fact, harbored a touch of fear toward Minami Yuji. Because she could always catch sight of certain children, kids who only the day before had worn faces full of contempt, who had even hurled venomous words at the director, kids deep in their rebellious phase, being called away by Minami Yuji. As they went, they even wore vicious expressions, loudly proclaiming that they were going to smash up Minami Yuji's pretty little face and leave it disfigured. But by the time they came back, setting aside the question of whether Minami Yuji's face had been disfigured or not, those children, who had been in their rebellious phase, had genuinely become unbelievably docile and well-behaved. Whatever the adults asked them to do, they would do it on the spot. When they saw people, they would properly greet them, so polite it was practically as though they had been swapped out for entirely different people. If it had only been one child like that, fine. But it was practically every single child Minami Yuji called over to him who turned out this way. This downright eerie sight had directly planted seeds of dread within the heart of the then 14-year-old Minami Reiko. Still at middle school age and having read her fair share of manga, she had even seriously wondered whether Minami Yuji might not be some kind of alien who had come down to Earth from another star system, mastering some evil brainwashing technology. Otherwise, why on earth would those rebellious-phased children, who at a single glance were clearly quite a bit stronger than Minami Yuji, listen to him so obediently? Those weren't the sort of kids who would sit down and listen to Minami Yuji reason things out with them, after all. And this kind of fear lingered with her all the way until she was 18, graduating from high school. Because the number of orphans the Masayama orphanage was responsible for taking in kept growing larger and larger, the beds and rooms, which had originally seemed like there was even some to spare, gradually became cramped. On top of that, with the sea wind eating away at the buildings, certain places needed further repair, and director Minami Mao's own health had also taken a turn for the worse, so the funds that had once been just barely enough started to come up tight. As for this state of affairs, Minami Reiko had, in truth, been considerably torn over it. Because going by her own academic record, she had the opportunity to go on to university. She wanted to break out of Mamashima. She wanted to live a brand new life of her own. And likewise, this was her one and only chance. But I'll do my best. I'll definitely go to Tokyo and find a good job. Director Mao. And everyone else. You all have to wait, I'll send money back to you. As reluctant as she felt, in the end Minami Reiko gave up the chance to attend university. Will you really be all right, Reiko? Going to Tokyo all by yourself? By the dockside, seabirds were crying out. Minami Mao, already with a layer of white frost dyeing the hair at her temples, looked at the Minami Reiko standing before her. Behind Reiko stood a whole crowd of children, all gazing over with eyes full of curiosity and worry. As the director, Minami Mao knew it well, Minami Reiko's temperament was delicate. She absolutely wasn't any kind of strong child. I'll be all right. Minami Reiko remembered that this was how she had answered. In truth, that had been a lie. Unease, fear, anxiety. Even her fingers, hidden away in her pocket, had been faintly trembling. She had only just graduated from school, and was about to start living on her own, having to look after herself while also seeking out work in Tokyo just to make a living. Forget about being an 18-year-old girl. Even many a grown man's heart, faced with that, would probably feel a little uneasy too, wouldn't it? Honestly speaking, if it hadn't been for Minami Mao, and the other children still standing right in front of her, she really would have burst out crying. And it was precisely at that moment that someone spoke up. I'll go along with Reiko. Dragging a suitcase that was just a touch taller than he was, a small little figure stepped forward. Minami Reiko felt that at that moment, she had probably been saved by Minami Yuji. I'll earn money together with her and bring it back. The sea breeze swept on past. Sunlight broke through the overcast clouds and spilled down. The strands of the black-haired boy's hair drifted along with that briny sea breeze. So he said. And so haven't the director and Yuji-kun both already turned you down clearly, again and again? Why do you keep coming around to our door? You people, the ingredients by her hand scattered all across the floor. But Minami Reiko paid them not the slightest mind. She merely glared, teeth gritted, at the several figures standing before her. People from the Toyokawa family. Walnut-chan, New History, Samsara Game, starting in the long dark with my waifu's help smash these goals. 100 power stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Chapter 23. Is this recruiting a son in 1644 words? Miss Minami Reiko, we've come here this time with no ill intent. We merely wish, on our employer's instructions, to invite Mr. Minami Yuji over to the family residence for a little catch-up. Oh really? No ill intent. This is what no ill intent looks like for you people. Lifting her eyes, Minami Reiko swept her gaze over the shambles of the room, and spoke in an icy voice. When Minami Reiko and Minami Yuji had first arrived in Tokyo, the money on hand had not been at all generous, so what they had rented was a rather cramped and shabby one-room dwelling. The walls of the room were thin, so much so that one could even clearly make out specks of mildew in the corners that no amount of scrubbing could quite clean away. But even so, this place was the home in which she and Minami Yuji had settled down in Tokyo. And yet now, the other party had arrived uninvited, and had even barged into the room without so much as a by your leave. The futons that had been neatly folded away in the cabinet had been yanked out in a tangled mess. The floor she had so carefully cleaned was now smeared all over with footprints, and there were signs of everything in the room having been rummaged through. And this was what they called no ill intent. For this we are deeply sorry. A formally suited man who looked to be the one in charge spoke up. Whatever losses have been caused to you this time around will all be borne by the Toyokawa family. As he spoke, he even lowered his head, in sync with the 2 or 3 bodyguards standing at his side, who lowered their heads at the very same moment. On the surface, it seemed to give off some indescribable air of sincerity. But from start to finish, there was not the slightest trace of apology in the other party's voice. Minami Reiko clenched her teeth tightly. What he had was nothing more than the cold detachment of business as business. That utterly through coldness in his words, far from being any sort of apology to her, it was more like contempt for everything she had striven for everything she had worked so hard to build up over the years. But unexpectedly, Minami Reiko did not fly into a rage. She herself was even taken aback at her own composure. Yet she very quickly came to understand why this was, because she had grown used to it. That's right. Grown used to it. This kind of unsolicited visit from the Toyokawa family was, in fact, Northwest longer anything close to the first time. She remembered that the first time the Toyokawa family had brought their people over to the Masayama orphanage, it had been just like this too. Uninvited. Talking past everyone. Hardline in their attitude. As if in this world, so long as one had money, anything and everything could be solved. She remembered it clearly back then. The other party had laid out some rather generous terms for Minami Mao. So long as Minami Mao agreed to let the Toyokawa family adopt Minami Yuji, they would take responsibility for every expense the Masayama orphanage incurred. To tell the truth, the Minami Reiko of that moment, upon hearing this news, had honestly been so overjoyed she'd nearly leapt into the air. Because that was the Toyokawa family we were talking about, a genuine, bona fide colossus of a conglomerate, a family-run enterprise. If they really did get their backing, then the Masayama orphanage would surely never have to worry about food or clothing again. Those dresses she had once never been willing to spend the money on, now she could buy one and toss it, buy another and toss that. That absolutely wouldn't be some far-off dream. However, the Minami Mao of that moment had not agreed. The answer she gave was also very simple. Minami Yuji did not want to become an adopted son of the Toyokawa family, and the Masayama orphanage was an orphanage that belonged to the children. It had to be a place where the children's own wishes were what came first. The Minami Reiko of that moment had been full of incomprehension. She'd felt that Director Mao was perhaps being just a bit too high-handed about it. No matter how you looked at it, they ought to have accepted the Toyokawa family's assistance. But only today did she come to understand even a little of the meaning behind Minami Mao's words. The Masayama orphanage was an orphanage that belonged to the children. It had never, ever been the kind of place that sold off its children to the outside world in order to seek out economic aid from the outside. Were they, these so-called adults, really going to make these abandoned children get abandoned all over again? It seems Mr. Minami Yuji isn't in residence, then, is he still at the agency? On the other side, the suited man in charge in front of her glanced at his watch. Still wearing that same talking past her attitude, that same looking down his nose gaze. If it had been the average 18-year-old girl, she would probably have been thoroughly cowed by this overwhelmingly terrifying aura by now. But Minami Reiko was nothing of the sort. "Do you really think I'd just obediently tell the likes of you?" Her voice was bracingly stern, her gaze raised, yet utterly resolute. She had been the one to bring Minami Yuji to Tokyo. Then as his elder sister, she absolutely had to fulfill her responsibilities as an elder sister. That pure yet utterly fearless attitude of hers even left the suited man in charge momentarily blank. It really was only momentarily. No adult was going to lower himself to scrapping with a child, and he was no exception. After all, every single thing the other party had said was, in truth, perfectly reasonable. They really were the ones in the wrong here. "In any case, since Mr. Minami Yuji isn't in, might we ask that you accompany us to the Toyokawa family residence first?" His voice was even and measured as he posed the question. "And what if I say no?" Minami Reiko remained dash. The suited man in charge. Say no. To tell the truth, he genuinely did not understand why the other party would say the word no. One had to keep in mind, that was the Toyokawa family. One of the few great financial dynasties in all of Japan that could be counted on the fingers of one hand, an existence that, in the most literal sense, could make the entire Japanese business world shudder simply by sneezing. And what about Minami Yuji and Minami Reiko? To put it in flattering terms, they were people the Toyokawa family had taken a liking to. To put it in unflattering terms, they were nothing more than bottom-rung people living in this kind of grubby low-rent flat. Now they had this kind of carp leaping the Dragon Gate opportunity dropped right in front of them, and they were actually saying no. How many people would yearn for this kind of opportunity, you have to understand, to be chosen as an adopted son-in-law for the Toyokawa family, and as a purely external party at that, with no prior ties to the Toyokawa group whatsoever. This in itself is already an enormous stroke of good fortune. Miss Minami Reiko, even if you won't think of yourself, you have to at least think of Mr. Minami Yuji. Can't you be a little more rational about this? He shook his head, and went on with his persuading. However, before his words could even finish, a voice had already rung out from outside. "I think Reiko-ne is already plenty rational, given that she hasn't kicked you lot out yet." He muttered out a puzzled syllable, then turned his head to look. And then he realized. At some unknown point, a tiny little figure had suddenly appeared in the doorway. It was a black-haired boy, and standing beside him was a blonde-haired boy who looked nearly his equal in good looks. Beneath the dim yellow glow of the doorway's motion sensor light, those handsome, adorable little faces were trimmed with a faint golden edge. Behind them, a flax-haired adult woman, taking in the chaotic state of the room along with 4 or 5 tall men, looked panic-stricken. She pulled out her phone, seemingly intending to do something. But the black-haired boy reached out and stopped her. The black-haired boy first lifted his eyes. It ought to have been nothing more than a child's harmless once-over. Yet for some reason, every single person there present, even including the suited man in charge who had only just been ordering Minami Reiko about, could not, in that instant, help but swallow audibly, and instinctively lower their heads. The black-haired child's gaze first swept over the interior of the room, taking in the floor that had been trampled into filth, and the futons that had been pulled out, and then, at last, came to rest on the suited man in charge inside the room. "If I'd been here, I wouldn't have wasted a single word, I'd have thrown you lot out first thing." Pulling his gaze back, he spoke just so. At the same time, his heart was full of speechlessness. These Toyokawa family people really did have terrible memories, didn't they? Here they were again, looking for a son-in-law. Read more, Walnut-chan New History, Samsara Game, starting in the long dark with my waifus. Help us hit our community goals. 100 Power Stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Chapter 24, Adjustment Chapter. Hello, dear readers. Unfortunately, this chapter is lost in the original source material. If anyone happens to find it, please let me know, and I will update it here. I'm releasing the next chapter right now to make up for it. Love, Chapter 25. Adopted son. In 2554 words, after being reborn into this world from the womb, Minami Yuji had consistently maintained a style of making zero effort to conceal his own out-of-the-ordinary qualities. After all, if one wished to get on better in society, then one had to put on display the corresponding value one possessed. It was a fairly down-to-earth matter. And it was precisely because this reliable adult had put on display a whole series of ways in which he was different from the average person that the Masayama orphanage, which had originally been operating in some difficulty, saw its social attention soar vertically over the course of those years. Quite a few people developed an interest in this orphanage that had been set up on a remote little island. But no matter what their purposes might have been, the money brought in by that vertical rise in social attention was no illusion. That's right, money was money. No matter what the purposes were of the reporters who came over to interview them, of the curious people who came over to visit and look around. The income they brought with them was real, hard cash. The children's daily life needs were secured. And he too was able, during that period, to grow up healthy and strong. On this matter, Minami Yuji felt his own approach hadn't really had much of anything wrong with it. If one absolutely insisted on identifying a mistake, then it was probably that he had taken action without having properly assessed the surrounding environment. Mainly, who could have ever seen this coming? That hugely famous Japanese mega-conglomerate, that colossus of a corporate group, the Toyokawa family, would actually take notice of a place like Mamashima. Do you know how remote Mamashima is? The only means of transport was a ferry that ran twice a day. Amid Ryukyu's endless stretches of little island waters. It was, quite simply, as inconspicuous as a single glass bead dropped into the water. Even the Toyokawa family, as a top-tier Japanese financial conglomerate with its hands and eyes reaching to the heavens, could not possibly know in complete detail about every sort of thing going on across all of Japan, let alone the newspaper that had run the headshot photo of Minami Yuji, the Mamashima Daily, which was just a Mamashima local publication with a grand total of 467 readers. Yet the Toyokawa family of all things had somehow found out about him, this child prodigy, so utterly different from ordinary people. And this was the part that Minami Yuji really, for the life of him, could not figure the reason for. It was only at that point that Minami Yuji finally learned the identities of those two certain little girls whom his own director, that is, Minami Mao, had him keep company with and play with from time to time. Toyokawa Sakiko and Misumi Hatsune. With that, the question that had been troubling our reliable adult was, at long last, answered. Because in the plot of a certain anime series about a girls' band, one that didn't seem at all like a girls' band anime, this blue-haired little girl called Toyokawa Sakiko was none other than the heir of the top-tier conglomerate, the Toyokawa family. As the heir of the Toyokawa family, even at a tender age, Toyokawa Sakiko's whereabouts would naturally be under the Toyokawa family's constant watch and concern. And so, Minami Yuji, a person who was as far from typical as it was possible to be among his peers, quite naturally leapt straight into the Toyokawa family's line of sight. What would this be like by analogy? The young miss of the Toyokawa family felt Tokyo's weather was too hot, and so went out for a change of scenery to escape the heat. And Minami Yuji was just some random passerby sitting in the shade of a tree to keep cool, except, before she'd even arrived at her destination, he, tree and all, had been directly incidentally sent flying by this big rig that was the Toyokawa family. That's right, incidentally. This was the thing that left Minami Yuji most utterly at a loss for words. And the problem lay precisely here. If it had only been being sent flying incidentally on the side by this Toyokawa family big rig, then that would actually still be fairly easy to solve. At worst, Minami Yuji could simply avoid meeting Toyokawa Sakiko from then on, and that would be that. But the problem was that the Toyokawa main bloodline, what they practiced was the Mukoyoshi, adoptive son-in-law system. The so-called Mukoyoshi was in essence a means by which, when a family was lacking a male heir, or when the male heir's abilities were insufficient, the family would select an heir from outside. Put in plain language, it was that the Toyokawa family, for several generations running, hadn't produced a single decent specimen. What they were born were basically all female offspring, not a single male heir. And in order to ensure the continuation of the Toyokawa family bloodline, and secondarily because there needed to be a male to shoulder the main pillar of the Toyokawa family. The Toyokawa family really had no other recourse but to select outstanding males from outside, have them marry into the Toyokawa family, then take them in as adopted sons and register them into the Toyokawa family, so as to make them responsible for the Toyokawa family's basic operations. Many people who'd watched the anime might feel that the Toyokawa family was a family that valued daughters over sons, but in actuality this was not the case. Most Japanese families viewed family name and bloodline as a matter of honor, and so would do their utmost to select a direct line male of the main house as heir. And a method like myokoyoshi was generally a last-ditch measure taken by the upper echelons of a family who had been backed into a corner, there genuinely being no direct line heir, the iron tree refusing to bloom, all the offspring being female, yet at the same time needing to ensure that the family's name such as Toyokawa would be inherited. It was simply a method that a family had no choice but to adopt in order to continue its own pure bloodline. Toyokawa Sakiko's father, Toyokawa Kiyotsugu, and her grandfather, Toyokawa Sadaharu, had come into being in just such a manner. For this reason, the Toyokawa family actually placed more value than anyone on the quality of the husbands brought in from outside. Therefore, Minami Yuji, who had already begun to display far above average talent at just 2 or 3 years old, was quite naturally targeted by the Toyokawa family. But the problem was that myokoyoshi, within Japan's plutocratic family setups like this, was inherently of very low status. Even if recognized as an adopted son, the myokoyoshi found it very difficult to be acknowledged by direct-line relatives. Most direct-line relatives of plutocratic families simply regarded myokoyoshi as nothing more than tools for inheriting the family business, workhorses purely working for the family, and nothing more. It wasn't as though, just because you'd hung the name Toyokawa on yourself, they would actually accept you. Many people might feel this is rather a case of the left brain fighting the right brain. How could one simultaneously value your abilities yet not value you as a person? All one can really say is that Japan's national character simply is like this. Sometimes, in their view, bloodline really is more important than ability. As reference for this point, just refer to the Japanese imperial family's intermarriage among close relatives and you'll be able to understand. And after analyzing all of this out, Minami Yuji really was at a loss for words. He had no choice but to be at a loss for words. Ever since being reborn into this world from the womb, there hadn't been many things that had let him take it easy. He seemed to have been running hell-level dungeons this whole time. And the result, good grief. The hell-level dungeon hadn't even finished yet, and you're going and running me through a nightmare level 1 on top of it. The key thing was, back then he'd thought that little kids were really all of a sameness, all looking more or less alike. Who could have guessed that twin-tailed little girl who would cry endlessly over a single fall, who looked all dopey and slow on the uptake, would actually be the heir to one of Japan's top-tier financial conglomerates? As a matter of fact, this was already not the first time the Toyokawa family had come knocking, wanting to request to adopt Minami Yuji. Just during the time on Mamashima alone, the Toyokawa family had come over 7 or 8 times, and every single time, they had come bearing exorbitant prices, wanting to adopt Minami Yuji. Even after being repulsed time and time again, they remained tireless, if anything becoming all the more determined to get hold of Minami Yuji. There was no help for it, the talent Minami Yuji had displayed was simply far too tempting. In the face of adult scrutiny, he could readily maintain a composed state of mind. To their difficult questions, he gave decorous, unflustered replies. On top of that intelligence far surpassing his childhood years. If they could start from him young, start from zero, and shape him with their own hands, then they would surely end up with a near-perfect Toyokawa family heir. On this point, our beloved by everyone classmate Minami Yuji really did have nothing to say either. The main reason was that he had never imagined this kind of trashy melodrama plotline of myokoyoshi would happen to him. The key part was, he was only 6 at the time. You're just going to come in and settle my marriage right off the bat. Although Minami Yuji didn't exactly have any kind of marriage phobia. But to have someone at the age of 6 suddenly come up and go, "Hey, old Minami, you want a wife or what?" And then get fixed up with a dopey, slow on the uptake, blue-haired wife, to go off to some place and serve as a pure toolman. Swap that around onto anyone else and it'd probably be unacceptable to them too. And so he had decisively expressed his refusal. So was it that same old hag who sent you lot over again? The moment he entered the room, Minami Yuji turned his head to the side, and looked over at the formally suited person in charge across from him on the tatami. Old hag. Even though this formally suited person in charge was a man of considerable refinement, upon hearing this form of address, he still couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. But very quickly, he shook his head. It was Madam Mickey who sent us. It has already been 2 years since our last appointment, and she wishes to meet with you once again. Is that so? It's already been 2 years, huh? Minami Yuji narrowed his eyes, took a sip of water, and then shook his head. How to put it? He had, in fact, long since anticipated that this day would come. Japan was a textbook capitalist society. Having money didn't exactly mean being able to do whatever one pleased, but people who had money were perfectly capable of dancing back and forth on the red line of Japanese law. The Toyokawa family, as a top-tier financial conglomerate, had taken the principle of resorting to any means necessary and pushed it to the absolute extreme. The very fact that they had been able to locate this kind of place itself indicated that the Toyokawa family had definitely done some investigating into their family situation. Today's visit was probably more along the lines of scouting the location, wanting to find out whether he was here. If he simply ignored it, then in all likelihood similar farces would only become more and more frequent later on. After all, as a top-tier financial conglomerate, the Toyokawa family, which had risen since the post-war era on the strength of energy and metals, was inherently incapable of, and didn't need to, care about the feelings of someone like Minami Reiko. To put it plainly, the Toyokawa family was a huge clan, and within it there was more than just that one faction of Toyokawa Sakiko and Toyokawa Sadaharu. So Minami Yuji stood up. Minami Reiko behind him, seeing him stand up, the expression on her fair-skinned face instantly underwent a change, and she anxiously let out a sound, Yuji, because she had picked up on it. Just then, Minami Yuji seemed to have made some kind of decision. Her expression was anxious, and she wanted to say something more. Because Minami Yuji was looking at her. Smiling, looking at her. Relax, Reiko-ne. This really was just a word of comfort from an 8-year-old child. Comfort coming from the mouth of an 8-year-old child really ought to have had no effect whatsoever. Yet for some reason, the agitation and unease that had only just been roiling in Minami Reiko's heart, in that moment had, astonishingly, all vanished into thin air completely. She let out a soft sigh. This time, she did not say another word more, merely silently meeting his gaze. Because she had discovered something. Whether back during the time on Mamashima, or right now. It seemed as if she had been being taken care of by Minami Yuji this whole time. So she wasn't going to say anything more. She would respect Minami Yuji's choice. And seeing that Minami Reiko's emotions seemed to have stabilized, Minami Yuji also turned his head to the side. This time, his gaze fell on the other side, onto Aqua Hoshino and Saito Kyoko. Sorry about this, Aqua, Auntie Kyoko, you've seen the situation for yourselves. The household really isn't in any state for receiving guests today, so I'll have to trouble you to head back early. No, it's us who should be the ones embarrassed, for paying you a visit so abruptly. Saito Kyoko really did live up to being a working adult, just one glance at Minami Yuji, then another at the crowd of people standing beside him, and she understood what he was planning to do. And so she gave a crisp nod of the head. Let's go, take me to meet that old hag who's still got half a life left and hasn't kicked the bucket yet. Minami Yuji turned his head back, opening his mouth cleanly and decisively. That's right. Not the nominal head of the Toyokawa family clan, Toyokawa Sadaharu. But the one standing behind that party. The one who, on the current timeline, has not yet passed away, the present true power holder of the Toyokawa family. Toyokawa Sadaharu's mother-in-law. Walnut-chan in P for more. New history, samsara game, starting in the long dark with my waifus. Help us unlock these community rewards. 100 Power Stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Chapter 26. Toyokawa Miki 2732 words. Whether or not there were any good people inside the Toyokawa family, that was something Minami Yuji wasn't clear on. But he was perfectly clear on one thing: the Toyokawa family's luxury cars were genuinely comfortable to ride in. When Minami Yuji sat down in one, he could distinctly feel as though his entire body sank slightly into the seat. As for everything else, the rest of it Minami Yuji actually didn't really understand. Things like interior trim, materials, and the like, in his eyes they really weren't all that different from one another. After all, the past life version of him hadn't ridden in this kind of luxury car much either. It had to be said. The Toyokawa family's driver really did possess superb driving skills. The black vehicle slid quietly into the lane, fast and steady, so smooth that Minami Yuji could hardly feel any jolting whatsoever. If it weren't for the neon dots of light flashing rapidly across the window outside, Minami Yuji might have even wondered whether the driver had actually started the car at all. Driving onward like this for about half an hour, the vehicle suddenly stopped. Minami Yuji's gaze followed along through the car window and looked outward. Beneath the dark indigo night sky, he could see, far in the distance, the black silhouette of that magnificent building hidden behind the mountain road. To be honest, this wasn't Minami Yuji's first time coming to the Toyokawa family residence. He had been here once before. But no matter how many times he came, the moment he saw the scene before him, he couldn't help but let out a heartfelt exclamation. So much money, huh? It really was rich. Even just looking over from here, you could already feel just how grand the residence perched halfway up the mountain truly was. These big Japanese conglomerates really were on another level. "Let's go," Minami Yuji said to the driver up front. The cap-wearing driver responded softly. That stopping just now hadn't been to drop them off at the front gate, rather, the driver had been reporting in to the staff on the inside, having them control the gate to open. After all, the Toyokawa family estate was simply too vast. As for the exact size, Minami Yuji actually didn't quite remember. His last visit had been some 2 or 3 years ago. He only remembered that this entire mountain seemed to be the property of the Toyokawa family. Because of this, getting out at the front gate would mean walking this long mountain road alone for at least 10 minutes. All you could say was that the overbearing CEO web novel trope had genuinely been mapped into reality. The Toyokawa family estate truly belonged to the category of place so vast that you could get lost just trying to go to the bathroom. Along with the gate swinging open to either side, the vehicle slid onward into the mountain road, continued driving up for about another minute or so, and the full sight of the Toyokawa main mansion naturally enough came into view. White and pale yellow columns alternated, supporting the building's overall structure, allowing the entire Toyokawa main mansion to loom three-dimensionally before Minami Yuji in its grand, laterally stretched form. The white light that streamed outward from the windows made the entire main mansion seem like a tower standing tall along the coastline. And at the entrance, Minami Yuji could clearly see a middle-aged man, wearing loose, exquisitely tailored sleepwear, his hair already slightly graying, was standing there. "So you've come after all, Yuji-kun." The man spoke as he watched Minami Yuji getting out of the car. The man had an authoritative presence even without anger, his expression calm, his voice steady when he spoke, his gaze always seeming to fix tightly on the other party, naturally giving people the feeling of being a head shorter than him. If it had been an ordinary child being stared at like this by an adult male, their face probably would have flushed bright red on the spot. They would have stammered, fidgeted helplessly, not knowing what to say. But "Oh, you're here. Old man Sadaharu, long time no see." Minami Yuji blinked, paused his voice for a moment, and after looking him up and down without the slightest reservation, opened his mouth. "You've aged quite a bit. Is the workload at the Toyokawa family really that stressful?" Toyokawa Sadaharu's originally serious, taut face, upon hearing this overly familiar remark, first went blank, and then a rare hint of a smile appeared on it. But very quickly, he realized that this smile was somewhat inappropriate, gave a slight shake of his head, and reined the smile back in. "You really are just the same as before." So saying, he turned around. No need for many more words, Minami Yuji caught his meaning, and followed in his footsteps at a slow, measured pace. Toyokawa Sadaharu. He lifted his head and glanced slightly at Minami Yuji walking alongside him. Toyokawa Sadaharu had met Minami Yuji before. After all, he did at least bear the Toyokawa family name, and was also the nominal head of the Toyokawa family on the surface. When it came to selecting candidates for adoptive son-in-law, he did have at least some say in the matter to one degree or another. And at that time, when he had heard that the next adoptive son-in-law candidate who had been chosen, Minami Yuji, came from an obscure orphanage on Mamashima, he had indeed clearly voiced his objection. After all, in his view, no matter how much they hungered for fresh blood to be infused into the Toyokawa family, there ought to be some attention paid to matching social standing at the very least. His granddaughter Toyokawa Sakiko was, after all, a proper, full-fledged bearer of the Toyokawa family bloodline. And weren't there many more exceptionally talented young people in Tokyo? Why did they have to pick an orphan from some remote little island, and Mamashima at that? Misumi Hatsune's hiding place. That was how he had thought. Only, all of these thoughts of his underwent a change after he met Minami Yuji and conversed with him. Because this child really was unlike any child he had been familiar with. It wasn't a difference in the well-worn cliché of talent, but rather something more pure, a quality almost like that of a superhuman, the kind of thing that even ordinary people could pick up on at a single glance. And so, Toyokawa Sadaharu's attitude shifted gradually from initial opposition to acceptance, and then later still to regret. Yes, regret. Immense regret. Because Toyokawa Sadaharu, himself likewise an adoptive son-in-law of the Toyokawa family, knew perfectly well just how arduous this path was to walk going forward. To outsiders, he was the head of the Toyokawa family clan, possessed of great virtue and reputation. But that was completely an illusion. An awkward, neither here nor there standing within the family, even though he now sat in the position of family head, he had to be on guard at every moment against being pulled down from his post. At the same time, he also had to deal with the intricately tangled power struggles of the various factions within the Toyokawa family. Like Sisyphus, ceaselessly pushing and pushing at the boulders that kept tumbling down from this great mountain that was the Toyokawa family, even with his head being bashed bloody, he could not dodge them. Yet however well they performed, even tired to the point of collapsing limp on their desks, those of them who were adoptive sons-in-law would forever be unable to obtain true recognition or attention from the Toyokawa family. Because between those of them who were adoptive sons-in-law and the people of the Toyokawa main bloodline, there existed an innate yet impossible-to-cross barrier, blood ties. So Toyokawa Sadaharu genuinely felt that it was a great pity. With Minami Yuji's talent, even without entering this outwardly dazzling gilded cage that was the Toyokawa family, he would still be more than enough to make a name for himself in society. But that was already an impossible thing now. Having been targeted by the Toyokawa main bloodline, that bunch who wanted the Toyokawa family bloodline to continue being passed down. Even Minami Yuji would. "Where's Sachiko?" The voice suddenly rang out, interrupting Toyokawa Sadaharu's train of thought, and he simply found it inconceivable. Things had already come to this point. And Minami Yuji was actually still concerned about his granddaughter. In this situation, shouldn't he be worrying about himself first? He didn't believe for a moment that Minami Yuji, who possessed the superhuman trait, was unaware of his own current predicament. But looking at the way Minami Yuji was gazing over at him, those curious, jet-black eyes that seemed to glitter with bright color, he maintained that consistently calm expression of his. "Is that so? That's nice. I recall she's the same age as me this year. More or less." The two of them carried on chatting like this, exchanging a line here and a line there. Finally, just as they were about to reach their destination, Toyokawa Sadaharu's footsteps came to a stop, finally breaking out of the household small-talk rhythm of Minami Yuji's conversation, and unable to hold back, he opened his mouth to ask. "Are you still concerned about Sachiko's matter? Was it any wonder he was the current head of the Toyokawa family?" Toyokawa Sadaharu's expression was as serious and steady as ever, but his speaking pace had, rare for him, quickened. "Don't you think you ought to be worrying about what you should do? I recall you weren't all that willing to become an adoptive son-in-law." With an ordinary child, Toyokawa Sadaharu wouldn't actually have said any of this. But Minami Yuji was different. He knew that the other party would absolutely catch the meaning within his words. The one you're about to meet is my mother. Madam Miki, do you really think she's going to listen to what you have to say so easily? He posed 3 questions in a row. In the original work, the specific family tree of the Toyokawa family and the timeline of their ages were never spelled out. And after Minami Yuji had transmigrated over, some details that hadn't been explained in the original gradually unfolded before him. Toyokawa Sadaharu was, at present, already at the advanced age of his 50s. His wife had passed away many years ago. Rationally analyzed, Toyokawa Sadaharu's age right now is at most somewhere around his 50s, anywhere past 60. I genuinely cannot imagine how Toyokawa Sadaharu could have bloomed on an iron tree and produced Masumi Hatsune. That would be a bit too vigorous in old age. But unlike his wife, his mother-in-law, that is, Toyokawa Miki, the one who had recognized him as adoptive son, she was still tenaciously alive. She was the real deal, from the post-war era onward, by means of energy, real estate, and metals, the true power holder who had witnessed the Toyokawa family rise to become a top-tier Japanese megaconglomerate. In response to this, Minami Yuji just shook his head. It's not as if we haven't met before, this time will definitely go smoothly too. And this overly optimistic attitude likewise made Toyokawa Sadaharu shake his head. He felt this view of his was just far too naive. You don't know the first thing about the darkness of the Toyokawa family. However, what he hadn't anticipated was, no sooner had these words left his mouth than Minami Yuji on the other side raised his own question. Even if I did know, what could be done about it? The instant this question was raised, it was as though a blade dripping with cold air had pierced straight into Toyokawa Sadaharu's chest. He was stunned for a moment. That was true. Even if you knew the darkness of the Toyokawa family, what then? It was, after all, the Toyokawa family. Situated within this enormous conglomerate of interlocked interests, Toyokawa Sadaharu was the person best able to understand the power that lay behind the Toyokawa family. An 8-year-old child, even if he possessed a sharp wit that ordinary people could not possess, in the face of a colossal entity like the Toyokawa family, what could he possibly accomplish? Relax, old man Sadaharu. Minami Yuji smiled and tried to pat Toyokawa Sadaharu on the shoulder, but after one attempt found that his own height was simply what it was, and could only cough once. When the cart reaches the mountain, there'll surely be a road. When the cart reaches the mountain, there'll surely be a road, huh? A trace of weariness appeared on the face of the perpetually serious Toyokawa Sadaharu. He neither affirmed nor denied Minami Yuji's words. His footsteps came to a halt. Minami Yuji followed his lead, and lifted his head. The two of them had walked up to a room with a pair of heavy reddish-brown double doors. What a pity it is. Leaning slightly against a wall with Baroque-style patterning, as a member of the Toyokawa family clan, Toyokawa Sadaharu's perpetually steady voice seemed to carry within it a slight sigh. As if in regret. And as if in reminiscence. However, a pity. I don't think so. Minami Yuji's voice rang out. These words made Toyokawa Sadaharu unconsciously lift his head. Immediately afterward, he saw it. Minami Yuji, standing in front of the door, was watching him with a smiling expression. Actually, seeing how full of life you are, old man Sadaharu, it makes me pretty happy. Toyokawa Sadaharu. Once again, he couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh. Inside the Toyokawa family residence, he had always worn a serious and stable mask. Even when gazing at his own granddaughter Toyokawa Sakiko, this was no different. Yet for some reason, when facing Minami Yuji, he simply couldn't hold that expression together. This really is exactly the same as before. Watching the way Minami Yuji walked into the room without the slightest hesitation, Toyokawa Sadaharu couldn't help but feel a touch of emotion welling up. He knew he himself was far less strong than his outward appearance made him seem. He was a cowardly, fragile, and timid person. That was also why, after his deeply beloved wife had died, he had been desperate to seek out new emotional comfort, and as a result had made a grave mistake with the mansion's female head housekeeper, secretly fathering Masumi Hatsune, terrified that the people of the Toyokawa main bloodline would seize upon this point and drag him down from the position of Toyokawa family head. Just as Toyokawa Sakiko had said in the original storyline, the one who truly fears the darkness of the Toyokawa family, isn't it you? He had been afraid of the Toyokawa main bloodline this whole time. But Minami Yuji was different. This child who was only 8 years old. From way back, he had always given Toyokawa Sadahara the feeling of someone who could solve any problem. In fact, he clearly remembered that Minami Yuji had also met Toyokawa Miki once before. And that one time, if memory served, it had ended with Toyokawa Miki taking a step back. But this time, would things still end in victory? He stared at that pair of reddish-brown double wooden doors, his always serious expression now, rare for him, carrying a touch of anticipation. Meanwhile, on the other side, inside the room, looking at the elderly woman before him, half reclining on the bed, kept alive by and for drip, her body already withered and gaunt, wrapped up entirely in just a single black peony nightgown. Minami Yuji narrowed his eyes, and beneath all the curious gazes turning his way inside the room, opened his mouth. So you're not dead yet, old lady Miki. Seek, Walnut-chan. New history, Samsara game, starting in the long dark with my waifus. Let's hit these goals. 100 power stones equals 1 extra chapter for the public. Chapter 27, Make Money. Then make big money. 3,126 words. The room before him was spacious, its furnishings dignified and lavish, yet a clear air of death hung over the place. The air of death, not the sort of vague, mystical thing you'd read about in novels, but something visible to the naked eye, something the body could palpably feel. Whether it was the dim environment created by the lights that had been deliberately turned down low, or the 4 drips suspended above the wrist of this woman pushing 100 years old, dripping ceaselessly, tick by tick, all of it carried with it the dense scent of death. Minami Yuji did not speak loudly. Yet within this room, his voice was crystal clear. The several middle-aged men and women standing off to the side, the instant they heard those words, their expressions changed. You had to understand, the person half reclining on the bed was a woman who had endured through 3 generations of the Toyokawa family, possessing the genuine, bona fide Toyokawa family bloodline. Even if all she did today was cough a couple of times, by tomorrow the entire Toyokawa family would have to shudder twice in response. That was no exaggeration whatsoever. Yet this 8-year-old child before them actually dared to utter such disrespectful words. You're being far too rude. Someone couldn't hold back, raising their voice in sharp rebuke. But that utterance had only just left their lips when it caught in their throat. Because Toyokawa Miki's withered, gnarled hand had already lifted, stopping him. Then, beneath everyone's astonished gazes, the elderly woman not only displayed not the slightest hint of anger at what Minami Yuji had said, on the contrary, a mocking smile squeezed its way onto her aged face. Ha ha ha, seeing this old hag still hasn't kicked the bucket, Yuji kid, you must be the most anxious one of all, This old fox. Minami Yuji's eyebrow twitched. He had initially wanted to test whether the other party's physical infirmity might have weakened her spirit along with it. If she could be provoked emotionally by just a word or two from him, then in the conversation that followed, he had every confidence he could steer things in the direction he wanted. But as it now appeared, the Toyokawa Miki before him had absolutely no intention of being baited into anger. She could even maintain her wits and bite right back in retort. Inwardly, Minami Yuji shook his head. As expected of an old creature who'd lived from the last century straight through to now, even brought to this state, her willpower was still as tenacious as ever. She was not so easily fooled. In that case Minami Yuji paid not a whit of attention to the Toyokawa family pureblood faction standing off to the side. Right in the face of their shocked and indignant expressions, he straight up dragged out a long bench and casually plopped himself down beside Toyokawa Miki. What exactly do you want with me? He'd decided to lay his cards on the table and go straight to the point. But in response to his decision to cut to the chase, Toyokawa Miki, on the contrary, showed no sign of urgency. She lifted her eyes and stared at the Minami Yuji before her with a kind of playful interest. Those deeply sunken eyes, the cold, sinister glint within them was just like a venomous serpent's. Even though the woman before him was already withering with age, if one let their guard down, it seemed she could still bite a chunk of flesh right off of you. Hee, Yuji kid, what's the matter? Not going to keep probing me like you were just now? She propped her body halfway up, opening her mouth to ask. If you called me over here just to chat and reminisce, then I think it's completely unnecessary. After all, what you need right now is rest, isn't it? To put it plainly, you're not as young as you used to be anymore, old lady Mickey. Humph. At Minami Yuji's slyly veiled remark, that she was already in decline, with not much time left, Toyokawa Miki just snickered out 2 breaths of laughter. Those aged eyes also narrowed slightly. This little brat, still as slippery as ever. Impossible to get a firm grip on him. As the Toyokawa family's de facto and current behind-the-scenes powerholder, Toyokawa Miki had seen countless people of every description, and had likewise manipulated countless people from the shadows. Yet she had never seen anyone like the Minami Yuji before her, someone who gave her the feeling of being impossible to pin down, completely impossible to see through. This was likely a kind of talent, or perhaps a kind of trait, even Toyokawa Miki couldn't quite say which. But it was precisely because of this, precisely this trait, that she found herself all the more fascinated by it. She had originally been worried that, after their 2-year separation, that superhuman talent of Minami Yuji's would slowly dissipate without a suitable person to guide him. But as it now appeared, her worries had been entirely unfounded. Gazing at the Minami Yuji before her, whose sharp edges and pointed corners were both even keener now than they had been before. A rare hint of a satisfied smile surfaced on Toyokawa Miki's old face. She raised her hand and with some apparent effort waved it. What you say is right. Hideki, all of you out. There are some things I want to talk over with Yuji kid in private. Grandmother Miki, this kid, he really is just far too rude. The middle-aged man called Hideki opened his mouth to speak. Though they belonged to a branch of the Toyokawa family, they could still be counted as people with Toyokawa family blood flowing through their veins. He genuinely hadn't expected that Toyokawa Miki would actually have matters she meant to keep hidden from them, that she would want to converse with Minami Yuji alone. This was something he simply could not accept, and he still wanted to try to persuade Toyokawa Miki otherwise. However, what he hadn't anticipated was, upon hearing his words, those amber-colored eyeballs of Toyokawa Miki's suddenly lifted up like those of a venomous serpent, and fixed themselves squarely on him. That blade-sharp gaze made his face flush bright red in an instant, leaving him unable to keep speaking. A moment later, he heard Toyokawa Miki's aged voice. I said get out, all of you. She fixed her stare on the middle-aged man before her, and that terrifying aura turned his face pale, with sweat trickling down from his temples. It's not. I mean, Grandmother Miki. The middle-aged man was drenched in sweat from head to toe, but he was cut off by Toyokawa Miki's hand-raising gesture. In that slow, drawn-out cadence characteristic of the elderly, contemptuously, word by word, like a knife slicing through flesh, she opened her mouth at a leisurely pace. Hideki, I'll tell you the truth, you really are just the same as before, completely incapable of improvement, without a shred of promise. The sight of you makes me sick. Every last one of you, get the hell out. The latter half of her words burst out abruptly. Toyokawa Miki let out a furious roar. It was hard to imagine that an old person already pushing 100 years could actually still produce such a sound. A terrifying atmosphere spread out in an instant. The crowd that had originally been keeping watch in front of Toyokawa Miki's bed practically rolled out of the room in the blink of an eye. At the same time came Toyokawa Miki's violent coughing. Minami Yuji. Minami Yuji did, more or less, count as a fine young man who respected his elders and cherished the young. Seeing this old grandma in such a state, he too shook his head, and reached out a hand to gently rub her back and help her catch her breath. It took quite a while before she finally got her breath back, and leaned half-reclining against the bed once more. Yuji kid, weren't you curious as to why I wanted to meet with you? This is the reason. Recalling the performance those people had just put on, Toyokawa Miki couldn't help but let a cold sneer surface on her face. Just about every Japanese family enterprise with a decently long history has these kinds of deadweight hangers-on, but precisely because of blood ties, all you can do is let them sprawl all over you and suck your blood as they please. Minami Yuji did not reply. He simply maintained his silence, with no intention of taking up the conversation. But Toyokawa Miki showed absolutely no sign of minding. She continued, at her own pace, word by word. The matter of the Toyokawa family factions, Yuji kid, you should know about that, As she said this, she watched Minami Yuji. More or less. The main thing is the conflict between the pureblood faction and the adoptive son-in-law faction, right? On this, Minami Yuji concealed nothing. After all, in front of this kind of ancient demon creature, who had lived for nearly 100 years without dying, there was no need to conceal anything at all. You really do know, then? Toyokawa Miki narrowed her eyes, the corners of her mouth curving up. The more she looked at this 8-year-old great-granddaughter's husband-to-be, the more satisfied she felt. That's right, it is conflict. The reason the Toyokawa family was still able to appear as harmonious as it did right now was precisely because she had not yet died. But once she passed, the power that belonged to her would slowly disperse. The conflict that inherently existed between the adoptive son-in-law faction and the Toyokawa family pureblood faction would inevitably intensify. As a matter of fact, this was exactly what happened in the original work. After Sadaharu's mother-in-law and wife, along with Kiyotsugu's wife, after these few pure-blooded Toyokawa family women all passed away one after another, the Toyokawa family, in the wake of that, gave rise to an intense round of infighting within its walls, causing the Toyokawa family to suffer losses amounting to 16.8 billion yen. And then after that came the storyline where Toyokawa Kiyotsugu, a member of the adoptive son-in-law faction, was hauled out and made into a scapegoat. But even so, I don't think there's anything for you to be in a rush about. Aren't there still old man Sadaharu and Uncle Kiyotsugu propping things up? Aren't both of their abilities pretty decent too? It was true, although Toyokawa Sadaharu and Toyokawa Kiyotsugu were only adoptive sons-in-law, the abilities of the two of them were beyond doubt, and they had run the current Toyokawa family in good, orderly shape. By rights, Toyokawa Miki shouldn't have to be in such a rush. But at this notion, Toyokawa Miki only let out a snort of derision, sneering coldly. No need to be in a rush, you say. It was undeniable that Sadaharu's and Kiyotsugu's abilities were indeed quite outstanding. But both of them on the inside are far too weak. She gave her head a light shake. As a woman who had survived alongside the Toyokawa family ever since the Showa era, Toyokawa Miki was inherently and instinctively disgusted by weak men. It was the same when it came to her two sons-in-law. She was capable of seeing through to most people's essential nature, and she likewise knew that, although Toyokawa Sadaharu and Toyokawa Kiyotsugu had outstanding ability, the truth was that their hearts were far too weak. Neither of them was a person to whom the family could be entrusted in full. And what's more, that guy Sadaharu still naively thinks, I don't know, he's got an illegitimate daughter on the outside. Toyokawa Miki spoke with a look of disgust written all over her face. But this reaction of hers actually brought a hint of surprise to Minami Yuji. After all, going by the original work, Misumi Hatsune's existence ought to have been hidden away to perfection. And given that Toyokawa Miki knew, why hadn't she gone ahead and exposed the matter outright? After all, no matter what the reason might have been, Toyokawa Sadaharu had indeed betrayed her daughter. Probably having picked up on what Minami Yuji was thinking. Toyokawa Miki merely said one cold sentence. Everything is solely for the sake of the Toyokawa family, nothing more than that. Everything she did was for the further development of the Toyokawa family clan. If she were to speak out at a time like this, there would inevitably be people who would seize upon the topic to make a scene, and the Toyokawa family, whose fragile surface-level peace had been propped up only by her, would become only all the more precarious. If it was for the sake of the Toyokawa family, all matters of familial affection and personal dissatisfaction could be set aside. That was the thing she cared about more. Minami Yuji, having now made sense of the entire situation, nodded thoughtfully. Then, for the first time, he actively spoke up and pushed the topic forward. But even if things are the way you say they are, old lady Mickey, I'm only 8 years old this year. There's no way you can let an 8-year-old child take charge of the Toyokawa family, even if you agreed. The other members of the Toyokawa family wouldn't agree, same thing I said 2 years ago. That's right. This was a problem Toyokawa Mickey could never solve. Because no matter how outstanding or how excellent Minami Yuji's performance turned out to be, there was no way the Toyokawa family was going to hand over such a vast family enterprise to an 8-year-old child. And it was precisely 2 years ago, in this very same place, that Minami Yuji had used this very reason to talk Toyokawa Mickey down. The situation now was much the same. Toyokawa Mickey did not possess the ability to make time itself speed up. Everything was still just as it had been on that day. To this very moment, she was still unable to get Minami Yuji to submit. No, I've figured it out. Gazing at the utterly composed Minami Yuji. 2 years ago, she had been at her wits' end with him. But the Toyokawa Mickey of the present all of a sudden laughed. She had figured it out. If the heavens above were to give her another 10 years or 20 years, she would absolutely use whatever means necessary to bring Minami Yuji into her grasp, and cultivate him into a successor fit to inherit the Toyokawa family. But the problem was, her time was running short. Truly running short. This woman who had risen up alongside the Toyokawa family could feel it. Death was even now following hard on the heels of her footsteps. I'll just put the choice in your hands, then. She split her mouth open into a grin. You're free at any time to borrow the Toyokawa family's power, to use the Toyokawa family to accomplish anything you want to accomplish. But the moment you borrow the Toyokawa family's power even once. She raised her hand, pointing at Minami Yuji's handsome, adorable face. You'll have to drag your ass back here, and become an adoptive son-in-law, and marry Sakiko. People are incapable of resisting temptation. Let alone a temptation like the Toyokawa family, one great enough to drive an ordinary person mad. On this point, she believed that even someone as firm in will as Minami Yuji was no exception. After all, a person's life is simply far too long. You'll encounter too many things, and you'll suffer too many setbacks as well. And then, on the day when the moment truly comes that a person runs into a difficulty they cannot possibly get past on their own, then, no matter how ugly the struggle, they will inevitably exhaust every single thing they can lay their hands on. Yet Minami Yuji remained calm. He simply gazed calmly at Toyokawa Mickey, and opened his mouth in just as calm a tone. Why should I agree to this? What's in it for me? His response left Toyokawa Mickey blank for a moment, then she burst into laughter. An ordinary person, upon hearing her actively offer a concession, would surely have been overjoyed and hastily agreed. Yet Minami Yuji actually dared to press for one step further. But she didn't feel there was anything offensive in this, on the contrary, this made her appreciate this inch-give-mile take little brat in front of her more and more. After all, negotiation was exactly like that. You concede one step, and the other party will press one step further to test your bottom line. Toyokawa Mickey narrowed her eyes. I'll get Hideki and those flies to stop pestering you. Is that so? Hearing this, Minami Yuji stood up. Fine. It was, once again, that same airy, casual reply. Mainly, there really wasn't anything for him to hesitate over. After all, this condition held only benefits for him, with no downsides whatsoever. Minami Yuji stood up. Behind him, Toyokawa Mickey split her mouth into a grin, and let out a laugh. You've already picked up on it, haven't you? The world outside Mamashima isn't as cheerful as you'd imagined, is it? You're still living with your sister in a cheap rented apartment right now, Sooner or later, you'll borrow the Toyokawa family's power, and in the end, you're definitely going to come back to the Toyokawa family. I sincerely look forward to that day. As the great doors swung shut, those were the words she spoke. And as for those words of hers, Minami Yuji indicated that he hadn't taken in so much as half a sentence. Because the path he meant to walk was one he had long since worked out. No particularly grand goal, even somewhat vulgar, really. And that was make money. And make big money at that. Then live the good life. Starting from Ichigo production. Becoming the #1 koyaku. Seek, Walnut-chan new history, samsara game, starting in the long dark with my waifus. Let's hit these goals. 100 power stones equals 1 extra chapter for the public. Chapter 28, If Only It Were a Fairy Tale, bonus chapter. 2105 words. Meanwhile, on the way back, Aqua Hoshino and Saito Kyoko, sitting in the back seat, had both fallen into silence. It wasn't really because of the crisp, decisive way Minami Yuji had laid out several full-grown men. Well, all right, that was a tiny bit of the reason too. But more importantly, the place Yuji lives in is honestly just too lousy. Propping his cheek up on his hand, his head tilted to look out the window, Aqua Hoshino's voice was calm, yet he didn't seem all that willing to let the matter go. In his past life, that is, during his Amamiya Goro period, he had been a medical student by background, and even though he had lived out in the remote countryside of Miyagi Prefecture, since the income of Japanese doctors was extremely high, Aqua Hoshino had never actually had to worry about food, clothing, shelter, or transport. And in this life, because he had Saito Kyoko, he had likewise never had to worry about these trivial day-to-day matters. But upon seeing the place where Minami Yuji and Minami Reiko lived, this reincarnator, having lived through 2 lives and never once having had to fret about getting by, was finally, truly able to feel the weight of life pressing down. Even though the inside had been tidied up immaculately spotless, those flimsy walls that couldn't block the wind at all, the cramped one-room layout, the low ceiling, the patches of mold in the corners that couldn't be scrubbed clean no matter what, all of it gave him a sense of conditions so wretched they couldn't possibly get any more wretched. And going by surface area, when it came time to sleep at night, the occupants probably had to pack away the little round table and the stools, then lay out bedding on the floor, just to barely fit 2 people into sleep in that room. Was this really a place an 8-year-old child could live? I imagine he must have his own difficulties to put up with. Saito Kyoko said this with her mouth, but in her heart she was secretly drumming with worry too. This was actually the first time she had ever seen a koyaku from such a struggling household. Most koyaku, when entering the industry, had to pay a certain amount of security deposit in exchange for getting opportunities at singing, dancing, and other skills training, so most families that could send their children to become koyaku weren't doing too badly financially. Which made it no wonder Minami Yuji wanted to make a name for himself as quickly as possible. If he didn't rise to fame quickly, with what could he improve his life? Just as she was thinking along these lines, a voice suddenly rang out from behind her. It was Aqua Hoshino's steady tone of voice. Kyoko-san, can I give all the roles I currently have to Yuji nii? Saito Kyoko shot a startled glance at the rearview mirror. Aqua Hoshino was looking right at her at that moment, looking at her very seriously. So it's not a joke, then? Saito Kyoko opened and closed her mouth, her flax-colored eyes lifting and falling, then lifting again. Clearly she had already reached a point of astonishment beyond which she could not be any more astonished. Although she had already been preparing, even before this, to tilt all of Aqua's resources over toward Minami Yuji, this wasn't exactly something that could be done in a single moment. After all, Aqua Hoshino's greatest dream was to become an actor, and that was the goal that Ai Hoshino had given him. Wanting to get him to agree to something like this, without even needing to think about it, she knew it would be as hard as climbing to heaven. She had even been preparing to spend a great deal of time on ideological persuasion with Aqua Hoshino. But what was the situation right now? Her own gloomy adopted son had actually abdicated and yielded the throne to a worthier man. And he'd done it voluntarily, no less. It was simply too unbelievable, to the point that even now her head felt all dizzy. I get the feeling you're thinking about some pretty rude things over there. Aqua Hoshino's sea blue eyes lifted up. This made Saito Kyoko duck her head down rather awkwardly and refocus her attention on the road. No, it's just that I felt your change of heart seemed maybe a little too fast. Is it really okay? Her words trailed off into something vague by the end. Because this topic, whether for Aqua Hoshino or for her, was simply far too sensitive. But I think AI would probably feel this was the better way to go too. Saito Kyoko didn't say anything. She just stepped on the brake, pulled the car over to the side of the road, and then turned her head back in shock. Because she really hadn't expected Aqua Hoshino would say something like this. You had to understand, having Aqua Hoshino become an actor was AI Hoshino's dying wish, after all. And he was actually just going to give that up so easily. I haven't given up. I'll keep working hard. But I've also come to realize, rather than just drifting along in a daze like this, continuing to have the agency tilt resources toward me, it'd be better to hand over all the resources at my current stage to Yuji NII. After speaking with Minami Yuji, Aqua Hoshino had already thought everything through completely. Rather than just wasting opportunities for nothing like this, it would be better to hand all the opportunities over to Minami Yuji, who had a much better shot. That person was a true star. If Minami Yuji could lead Ichigo Production back to a flourishing era, then as a member of Ichigo Production, he himself would surely have more opportunities going forward, too. If AI Hoshino were still alive, she would surely have supported his line of thinking as well. You really? Saito Kyoko gave a little hiss through her teeth. She was getting more and more curious now about what exactly Minami Yuji and Aqua Hoshino had talked about after meeting. Why did her adopted son trust Minami Yuji this much? Her line of thinking was, in fact, perfectly normal. After all, in the original work, Aqua Hoshino had acted continuously for 4 years before finally recognizing that he had no real talent for acting, and on top of that, he had completely closed off his heart to absolutely everyone. And the shift in Aqua Hoshino's state of mind only came after his conversation with Himekawa Taiki, when he had mistakenly believed that his biological father had already died, and had thus briefly set aside his thirst for revenge. Throughout that period, the time span of Aqua Hoshino's awakening had stretched on for a full 15 years, and even then it was only a short-lived awakening. After that, he realized his biological father was not yet dead, and once again set off on the road of vengeance. But this time was different. After conversing with Minami Yuji, that is, after only 2 years of participating in acting, Aqua Hoshino had already recognized the issues within himself, and was no longer as fixated as he had been in his past life. And for this point, Aqua Hoshino really was extremely grateful to Minami Yuji. However, even though what you said sounds really cool, Aqua, the thing is. Saito Kyoko gave a dry cough, finding it hard to fully hide her awkwardness. Your roles are actually all just bit part supporting roles with hardly any lines. There aren't any lead roles main characters among them. In the short term it can really only provide Yuji-kun with some income, but there's absolutely no way it can make him famous. Aqua Hoshino was caught off guard. That consistently composed, handsome face of his showed a rare flicker of embarrassment. His roles sounded like there were quite a lot of them. But those were, in fact, all supporting roles that Godanda Taisher had pulled strings to get for him. On screen, they probably amounted to just a few scenes, with hardly any lines, and the pay was pitifully small. With this little screen time, there's no way at all Yuji-kun could rise to fame in one stroke. Putting it bluntly, even if he's got the acting chops, he's still got to have a stage on which to actually display those chops, right? However, I believe in Yuji NII, opportunities for lead roles are definitely going to come. It might be slow, but sooner or later they'll come, because his ability is right there for everyone to see. Aqua Hoshino spoke up, rarely for him, in a tone of firm conviction. That assured, self-confident look of his even left Saito Kyoko somewhat baffled. The main thing was that she really couldn't figure out where exactly Aqua Hoshino's confidence was coming from. Wasn't this just too much trust in Minami Yuji? Wasn't the one he was meant to be championing supposed to be AI? But the problem is, this isn't a question of whether or not we believe in Yuji-kun. Giving her head a hard shake to fling all the stray thoughts clear out of her mind, Saito Kyoko opened her mouth and explained. That's right, it wasn't a question of believing in Minami Yuji or not, rather, it was that she didn't believe in the strength of their own Ichigo Production. That's right, Ichigo Production was just a small-scale agency. And within the industry, personal connections and favors were absolutely indispensable. Even if a lead role opportunity did come up, plenty of producers and directors would surely prioritize artists from the big agencies, rather than someone from an unknown small agency like Ichigo Production. Putting it bluntly, just because Okoyaka's acting is superlative, that's going to be enough to bring work opportunities in. Where in this world would you ever find something that good? Saito Kyoko said this, and on top of it heaved out a heavy sigh. That's right, the Japanese industry, to put it plainly, was just one enormous, tangled, intricately interconnected web of personal connection power blocks. How could there possibly be the kind of fairy tale where someone goes, "Hey, your agency's Koyaka has really great acting, why don't you come try out for a lead role over at our place?" No connections. No capital backing. Not even any noteworthy works to show. And a pure unknown rookie parachuting in wants to get a lead role. That was just a fairy tale out of a picture book. Thinking this, she stretched out her hand, preparing to start the car back up once again. And then, the rapid, urgent ringing of a mobile phone began to sound. It was her mobile phone's ringtone. Who was it? Someone deliberately picking the very moment when her mood was low. Saito Kyoko felt a flash of displeasure, but out of professional decorum, she still picked up the phone. However, before she could even open her mouth to speak, the party on the other end was already speaking in an urgent rush. "Good day to you, is this the Ichigo Production Agency? The thing is, we have here a film lead role audition that we'd like to hand over to your agency's Minami Yuji. We were wondering if your agency's schedule might be able to free up some time, so we could arrange to discuss this in detail." Hello. Whatever the other party was saying after that, Saito Kyoko could no longer hear a single word of it. Because at this very moment she had been completely stunned into a daze. Her flax-colored eyes, full of utter shock at this moment, turned to look at Aqua Hoshino behind her. The two of them met each other's gaze. In each of their eyes, to one degree or another, there was a touch of incredulity, and on this point, Aqua Hoshino was just the same. Even though he had known his own Yuji Nii's acting was superb, and that opportunities would come sooner or later. Even so, wasn't this coming just a little too soon? Were there really fairy tales in this world? Walnut-chan New History, Samsara Game, starting in the long dark with my waifu's 100 power stones equals +1 bonus chapter for everyone. Creators thoughts _walnut_chan. Hello, dear readers. Unfortunately, this chapter is lost in the original source material. If anyone happens to find it, please let me know, and I will update it here. I'm releasing the next chapter right now to make up for it. Love, add to library. Add to library. Add to library. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.